So a couple interesting things to talk about it. You may have seen that Schulz has responded to the allegations, but not really though. So he's kind of clarified a couple things about sort of the timeline of everything and like people attacking him for the previous comments that he had made about black women, and then there was the shit that he said about Kendrick, and then people even got a little bit crazier. And you know, he apparently was having like death threats against his family and shit on social media, which sucks, and I wouldn't wish that upon anybody. But he kind of like ties that in to this stuff about what he said with Kendrick, and I just don't see the connection at all. I mean, it's one thing to say, you know, the social media pressure was huge and this was heating up and people were saying all this crazy stuff about my family, so I went really hard and I said some, you know, fucked up shit about Kendrick. But that in no way, first of all, that in no way justifies the type of thing that he said about Kendrick, which was just, it's just a weird thing to say. Like, there's nothing, you know what I mean? It's one thing to be like, oh, I went really hard, I really dragged his name through the mud, I said some fucked up shit, you know, but it's like, none of that is like, fits into the category of this like weird, gleeful joke. It's like, the problem with that to me is not that like Kendrick is a victim, it's just like, why would you say that, bro? Like, what would possess you to say that? Especially if you felt like this was like a high pressure moment. Really, the explanation for that, if there is one, would be that he took it so completely unseriously that, you know, saying something like that, like he was just fucking around. He didn't really think that even that many people would see him saying that because he was just fucking around. Like, that would be the way to explain that, is like, oh, you know, I say weird fucked up shit like that on my podcast all the time. It's shock stuff. I'm just fucking around. But to make it like, oh, I just had to go as hard as I could, and it's like, and that's what you said, bro? Of all the things that you could say, that's what the fuck you said? So none of that has been explained away, in my opinion. But then he also addressed the whole thing with this ex of his, Sarah, and so apparently she wasn't 16 when they dated. I guess that was something that people on social media kind of, I don't know if she said that about herself at some point or whatever, but she was 19 though. She was 19 when they dated, and he was like either in his 30s or approaching 30s. And so that's still weird. I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, but it's like, you know, still, it's weird. She was 19 years old, and also, you know, he didn't address anything about the abuse of her at all. So he focuses on the fact that she wasn't 16 when they dated, and he's like, oh, they're throwing all this stuff at me, they're trying to make me a this and that. And it's like, yeah, okay, fair enough, she wasn't 16, but 19 is not that much better. And I will say that, like, this was some years ago, and so while it is still inappropriate for someone who's like over 10 years older than that to date a 19-year-old, it also, there was less social pressure about it, you know? Like, if I today as a 28-year-old was, you know, talking to a 19-year-old, even just talking to a 19-year-old sexually or whatever, it would be in the front of my mind that, like, this is inappropriate. If, you know, like, people would jump down my throat about this 100%. It's like, it's a thing that's in the zeitgeist, right? But, you know, a few years ago, still to some extent, like, I'm sure it was kind of on his mind a little bit, but less so. Like, in other words, you could get away with dating a 19-year-old a few years ago if you're Andrew Schulz. I don't know how, you know, probably over 5 years ago this was. So it really doesn't make it that much better, and he just doesn't address anything about all the shit she said. That wasn't the main point of what she said. I don't think she ever said anything about the age gap. She was talking about the abuse, and so he just didn't respond to her allegations at all. So on one hand, I understand why he didn't do that. He's probably just like, well, what she said is what she said, and I'm not going to get into that. But it also doesn't make it go away, and it doesn't like change anything about what she said. And like you were saying, it doesn't change the fact that, like, you can totally picture him behaving in that way. So overall, his response seems pretty ineffectual, but also there's just something, I guess this is the kind of thing that happens with these people in these positions, but they kind of come unraveled a little bit, where it's like he's able to maintain a lot of bravado and he has that sort of like confident demeanor, but he's kind of oscillating between like playing the victim and trying to brush it off and like, these weird like over the top jokes, and sort of it's all just kind of looking a little spiralish to me. Like, obviously this stuff is affecting him, and if he has people like literally harassing him and threatening him and his family on social media, I can understand how that's a bit unnerving. But then once it gets to the point of the Kendrick thing, like, I have no sympathy for you at all, because like you brought that on yourself. Like, even if you want to like engage in this back and forth with this person and say something that's going to be perceived as like a hit back, the thing you chose to say is the weirdest possible thing. It's so weird, and it plays into these allegations that are now being levied against you, against someone you dated. So, will anything come of this in terms of his career? Probably not. People have pointed out he's probably just going to be bigger because of this. But, it's he has made some responses against it, and I don't know, it's not doing much for me.
Yeah, it's really weird. It's very, very weird. And unfortunately, yes, he probably will just be bigger from this. But, it's just so telling, right? If your mind goes there, it says a lot about you. I don't care how backed into a corner you're in, or how much you feel attacked, or that a vicious attack is what's required of you in response. If to you sexual assault is a threat, it says a lot about the way you think. Plain and simple. The stuff about her being older than we originally had heard or whatever, that's good. But it's still pretty gross, like you said, 19, and he was in his late 20s or early 30s. That's pretty young. I work with some 19-year-olds. There's a few in this one department I have to work with like twice a week, and they're great, but they're kids. Like, it's really hard to... I know that's legal and stuff, but it's still kind of gross, at least with the most 19-year-olds I've met. I can't picture seeing them as anything other than a kid at this point. If you're like 25 and they were 19, sure. Even that, I think, at that age, you do so much growing, so in such a short amount of time. Like, the difference between a 30-year-old and a 40-year-old is much smaller than between a 20-year-old and a 30-year-old, right? Like, and then once you get past a certain point, 25, 30... your brain's done developing, you're kind of who you are, you're going to get wiser, calm down a bit and stuff, hopefully, but your personality's pretty much cemented, you are who you are. But at 19, you're still figuring that stuff out. So, there's exceptions. Some people had a harder life, had to grow up a little quicker. Maybe he was in a more of a state of arrested development. It can not be that gross sometimes if between the right people. But as a rule, I don't think it's icky. And it says a lot about him too. And when you start stacking the things together, and if you look at any isolated facts from someone's life, they can look bad or this or that, sure. But we also know how the guy presents himself, the way he talks, who he is, the kinds of things he finds funny, the kinds of things he considers priorities in life. Like, it's not like we're working with just these facts, but when you take these and everything else, it really starts to paint a picture of a douchebag.
Also, the Jay-Z allegations. I want to talk about this because I have posted a video about the Jay-Z allegations already on my channel, and on that video, I jumped behind the accuser pretty strongly, and I still do to an extent, but there are some pretty major inconsistencies in her story, and it seems like, as of right now, Jay-Z's legal team is kind of in the advantage position because, so as I mentioned before, this girl is autistic, but she still seems, she's coherent, she's cogent. She was able to do an interview with NBC News, and in this interview, she addresses that there are some pretty major inconsistencies in her story, some of which are the kind of thing that a victim could get wrong, especially after all this time. Things about like how much time certain things took, or people she spoke to at the VMAs, which is supposedly how she got roped into all this stuff. But the major inconsistency is that she basically said that a friend drove her to the VMAs, which is 5 hours away from where she would have been living at the time. And then I guess supposedly dropped her off and left her there as a 13-year-old girl. So that's a little bit weird. How did you end up at the VMAs? 5 hours is not a short trip. But then she said after this incident, she called her father, and her father came and picked her up, and then drove her home, and they didn't say a word. They drove home in silence. So NBC called her father, and her father says he has no recollection of that whatsoever. And he said that he feels like that's something he would remember, and he doesn't. So that's pretty damning, but it's also doesn't really seem like it's not very conclusive either, right? Because they called her father. We don't know anything about this guy. He kind of hinted, he said something like, I have a lot of things going on, but that seems like something I would remember. So we don't know what that means, right? Maybe this is a troubled guy. Maybe he had a lot of things going on. Who knows what that means? Maybe he wasn't that involved in this girl's life, and he was just the only person she could call at the moment. Maybe he was closer to where she was, and that's how he was able to come. But either way, he says he doesn't remember it. So to me, it feels like if you're the father and you get a call from NBC and that's your response, it seems like one of the first things you're going to do is probably call your daughter and be like, hey, what's going on with this? So probably you would have conversations like that, or vice versa. Maybe she called him. I don't know. Again, who knows what their relationship is? But that is a very crucial piece of the story. Like, not having the father be able to corroborate this story, especially, if it was driving 20 minutes down the road to pick her up and then he never knew what was going on, it would be reasonable that he forgot that. But, suddenly getting a call that you have to drive 5 hours to pick up your, crying daughter because of some incident and not remembering that's a problem. And so regardless of whether she's lying or whether there's something else going on here, it doesn't seem like they're going to be able to overcome that when it comes to proving it in court. So we'll see. That's not the end of this story. There could be more that comes of it. Who knows? Maybe they called the wrong guy. Maybe that wasn't her actual dad. Maybe when she said her dad, she meant somebody who's not her actual biological father. There could be more to this. But that is a pretty crucial piece of this story that right now is not looking like it backs up what she said.
Yeah, I saw that, and I've looked a little bit into it and watched a few different things, and it does seem like there's a lot of holes in her stories. I'm someone who, usually sides with the victim here, but it doesn't look good. There's those that you point out, and sure, there's some arguments like, yeah, maybe her dad lived closer to Manhattan than he did Rochester, so it made sense for him to go get her, and it didn't stand out in his mind. But I don't know. I feel like it would. And there was another thing with, she said when she was driven to the house by P. Diddy's driver, she was driven to a white house where things happened, but she was standing out on a porch or something like that, talking to these guys. I can't remember who they are, but they're from some band. And when NBC News reached out to them, they said that they did not attend the VMAs, and that they were on a tour of the Midwest at the time. So, that's another inconsistency. And at first, her story of talking to them sounded like it was a detail that made it real, because she said they're talking about the one guy's tattoo of the Last Supper on his arm and stuff. And it just seemed like such a random detail. It's one of those that, makes the story sound true. And I think maybe she believes her story, but I don't know that it's true. And then, of course, the friend that drove her, has passed away since then, so she can't confirm it or be reached out to. I mean, it seems pretty fake, and I don't know. I want to believe the victims and stuff, but in this case, I don't think it's legit. There's too much fake stuff, or too much stuff that's just inconsistent and doesn't seem right with her story, which is good, because I liked still being able to like Jay-Z.
Yeah, and the other thing with the Jay-Z story, some people are speculating that he may have paid off the father to say that he didn't remember that story, which is possible and not above Jay-Z at all. And also in his statement, he said something to the effect of, I look forward to showing you just how different I am, which is an odd, clearly that's a little threatening, but it's also, that's a very evocative thing to say. Like, that could mean anything. So I don't know if he did himself any favors by saying that. Maybe not related to the court case, but just in general. I mean, to me, that kind of lends credence to any conspiracy theory that might pop up about this. So, not saying that I believe that he did that he paid the father off, but I will say that there's something a little bit, my intuition is scratching a little bit about that, because it is such a damning detail. That's somebody who would need to corroborate that story, and he's not. But there's something about the shortness of it. NBC called her father, and he said that he doesn't remember that, and he would remember it. Seems like something he would remember, but he doesn't. It's just, not saying I don't believe that, but there seems like maybe something's off about that. But even if that's the case, there are still the other holes in her story. The other thing, too, is that she could have the year wrong. I mean, if she remembers talking to certain people that weren't at the VMAs that year, it's possible that she's just off by a year or two, which isn't that. I mean, how well do you remember what year it was when you were 13, 14? I mean, I guess if she can track it back to the age that she was at that time, then maybe that's how they landed on the year 2000. But I don't know, maybe they're a year or two off or something. I don't know. I mean, again, with the inconsistencies that have come up, that definitely deflates her story a lot. But it's not out of the question that Jay-Z is pulling some behind the scenes strings to try to do exactly that, deflate this case. But as of now, it's looking like her story doesn't add up and that there may be some delusion involved. But I'm not fully ready to embrace that yet. I'm a lot more on Jay-Z's side than I was. But we'll see. And if it turns out that the evidence is really not on her side and he didn't do it, then I'll take down the video that I made about him, because I was very much operating under the assumption that it was true, and maybe that was wrong of me. But, I think that, I think it was a serious allegation. I think Jay-Z knows it's a serious allegation, and unfortunately, it's not something that I can't picture him doing. But, maybe that's where I'm in the wrong. So we'll see how it plays out. But yeah, something about that thing with her dad, I don't know. Something about that is rubbing me the wrong way a little bit.
Okay, yeah. The Jay-Z thing, it doesn't look good for him. I mean, the saying that, he can't wait for it to see how different he is, it seems kind of rough and aggressive, right? I mean, I guess I understand if someone's trying to destroy your livelihood, being pretty angry with them. But I don't know. It doesn't make him look as innocent as a more non-threatening statement would. But there's just so many holes in her stories and stuff. It definitely seems like it didn't happen, or didn't happen the way she remembers it, at least. But I don't know. She definitely could have mixed up the years. So, maybe that running into those guys and talking to them does make sense, because it was a different year. There's certainly yearly events that I've only attended one of that I had to, kind of figure out which year I attended. Was that 04? Was that 05? And, had to look stuff up online to figure it out. So I get that. I would think, though, with the assault, she would remember. I've never been assaulted in that way, thankfully, so I can't really speak from a victim's perspective. But I would think something that serious would stick out, and I would remember this happened to me when I was 13, and then, of course, you'd figure out what year that VMA was or whatever. But I don't know. Like I said, I can't speak from the victim's standpoint, but it doesn't look good for her story, which looks good for Jay-Z, I guess.